Okay, my friends, we're going to try to look at what has happened in the last week in Ukraine, and we're going to try to do it very quickly. So last Saturday, July 1st, and we're going to go through this Saturday, July 8th. So General Miley said last week that the counteroffensive will be long and bloody. Part of that is because of the weapons that Ukraine has. They don't have air superiority, so they can't fight the same way that the U.S. forces would fight. And so Ukraine has not gotten weapons until recently that they needed to be able to fight. And so now they have actual tank superiority. But in the meantime, the Russians have been able to lay mines across, well, essentially the entire line. I saw the other day that the Ukrainians are now facing a minefield roughly the size of Florida, or the potential minefield that the Russians have laid in is roughly the size of Florida. Ukraine's the size of Texas, and this area that Russia controls, which they have been able to lay mines, is very large. So now they keep running into these minefields and entrenched positions, and so this is going to be long and bloody. They have to change tactics to guerrilla kind of tactics rather than armor. It looks like, until they can punch through. Okay, so Belarus is building an army camp for Wagner. This is one of the few things that makes sense about what happened with Prigozhin. The new EU president was in talking to Zelensky to show his support. The Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, although he's up for election shortly, and we'll see what happens there. Sunday, 2nd of July, there was heavy fighting on both sides of the counteroffensive, and both sides are claiming that there's heavy fighting, although Ukraine is taking ground around Bakhmut. Now, they're not taking a lot of ground. They're not taking a lot of real estate. They've switched gears into trying to degrade the Russians, degrade their ammo supplies, degrade their weapons, degrade their people to the degree possible. But they're still going to have a very bloody attack through minefields in order to get where they're trying to go. The CIA chief has said that the war is corrosive for Putin. This was, again, last Saturday. He was at a conference at the British Prime Minister, or sorry, the British Defense Ministry said that the Russian aerospace industry has been very hurt by the war. They can't get chips, or they can't get supply parts, so they have to cannibalize their planes. Russia's first drone strike in 12 days last Sunday, and that's really interesting because it used to be these waves and waves of drone strikes. Why aren't they doing it? My guess is that they just simply don't have enough drones, and this is my guess, to continually try to terrorize the population. Okay, and then Monday, the CIA chief was saying that it's a prime opportunity to recruit spies. He actually said this on Sunday. This was an article on Monday. But yeah, there's a lot of disaffected Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine and in Russia that it's ripe for picking. Prigozhin forecasts more victories at the front in a new video. Well, okay, we'll see more about Prigozhin. The way Prigozhin's been cast in the media in Russia is just, it's bizarre to watch. Unilever is named as an international sponsor of the war by Ukraine. Now, Unilever is a really interesting organization. They're this huge multinational conglomerate that has all kinds of brands that that you probably use, and they're still doing business in Russia as if nothing has changed. And so I think some have called for boycotts. Jake Bro, for example, has called for boycotts. And I think that would be a good idea. And boycotting just Unilever would put all the other companies that are still doing business as if nothing has changed on notice that they could be next. Small Ukrainian gains in the counteroffensive, but again, minefields are slowing down the counteroffensive as both sides are claiming success. The commander of the Chechen Special Forces was killed in Ukraine on Monday, and then Monday was also the McFaul interview. I did a video a few days ago with 3 leaders, and McFaul's interview was part of that. So McFaul was the former ambassador to Russia, and he had a really interesting thought. Now, a lot of you have said things like, well, if you just get rid of Putin, we'd have a different whatever. And others have said, well, if you get rid of Putin, who you get, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. Which is it? McFaul's argument was that it's not just culture. Although it is culture, you're more likely to get a devil from this culture because it's this kind of culture that has this Russian racial superiority kind of thing and is complex, like, well, we're Russia and everybody else is not. And you're more likely to get that, but not necessarily. And what we do know is that we can't work with Putin, and he has shown that. And leadership really does matter. Who's in charge makes a lot of difference. Please go back and watch that video if you have not seen it. It'll help you understand some things. And then finally, Putin's comment on funding of Wagner was fascinating because he just like he just gave evidence to The Hague about war crimes by saying, yes, we have funded Wagner, and so all their atrocities are now on us all over the world. So it's a really interesting kind of thing. Okay, that was Monday. Tuesday, RT was saying that Moscow was targeted by drones, but we shot them down. See how awesome and tough we are. We've shot down these drones. And well, that you're being targeted does not make you look strong. Yes, you did shoot them down. That's fine. In RT, they were accusing Kyiv of another terrorist attack. Well, what have you been doing? If that's a terrorist attack, what? Oh, it's just a special military operation. That doesn't count. Russia claims to have intercepted the drones. Zelensky was visiting Sofia on the same day as the parliamentary vote on Ukrainian membership. He was going to be going there in a couple of days, and we'll talk about that. And then Putin was assuring Asian nations of stability in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And that's really interesting that he was going out of his way to do that, where before they would just jump to, and they would when Putin said jump, they would say how high. And then China and was urging solidarity with India and Russia as this no limits partnership, which clearly has limits. They weren't going out of their way to say arm them and give them everything because they don't want sanctions too, but trying to say we're all in the same trading block and that kind of thing. Now, this article was absolutely fascinating. RT was carrying this article that said, Dystopian European Media Freedom Act is a Trojan horse. Well, what is this Dystopian European Freedom Act? Well, it says this, and I'm quoting, EU officials are on the verge of approving a new European Media Freedom Act promoted as a new law to protect journalists, their freedom, and their press pluralism. Sounds good to me. It goes on to say, however, any thinking person might start by asking how exactly that squares with the bloc's top-down censorship of voices published on platforms that counter their establishment narratives, like RT, for instance. Okay, and that's fair. And I watch RT, and I try to understand RT, but I have to work around things to get to RT. I have to go through Rumble in order to see video. I can't find it on Roku, for example, because it's blocked. I get that. But if you go to Russia, can you see all these European papers? And the answer is no. And so they're upset about what Europe's doing, but they're not willing to. So it's just hypocrisy. Okay, Russian soldier is forced to return to the front, hanged himself. Now, that's happened before. I mean, that's happened in all kinds of militaries. But this article was a really interesting example of somebody who has been lied to. Their time was extended. They're told they have to go back to the front where they weren't supposed to have to go to, and it was a really sad thing. And it's an example of what's happened to, I think, a lot of Russian soldiers. Okay, Wednesday, Ukrainian seize trenches around Bakhmut. If you look at a deep state map and you watch Bakhmut, Ukrainians are really gaining ground around Bakhmut, and it's really interesting. It's like watching it reverse from what happened over the previous 6 months. There's a steady, deliberative advance that meets Russian resistance all across the front lines. So the front lines are not making these huge gains, but they are chipping away here and there, and you can see stuff going. But the narrative in Russian media is it's just a failed counteroffensive. So, but saying it doesn't make it true, but that's the narrative that keeps getting pushed out. Okay, Ukrainians' tech push to counter Russian drones. Absolutely fascinating article last Wednesday. There were 7 companies, I'm quoting, 7 companies that sell drones to the state when we began this project last year. Today, it's 40, and it will be 50 by the end of the year. And their goal is to push out 200,000 Ukrainian-made drones by the end of the year. That's pretty impressive. Okay, the Kyiv Post talked about how Russia is using chemical weapons during the Bakhmut artillery bombardments. They were using something called lewisite. Now, I'm not familiar with lewisite. I haven't heard of lewisite before. Lewisite is a chemical compound commonly called vesicant or a blistering agent because it causes blistering on the skin and mucous membranes on contact. So not a good look. Probably, I don't know that it's a war crime, but it sounds like it's in that kind of category. Okay, and then finally, Ukraine's about to ratify a free trade agreement with Turkey. That's a great thing. I think any free trade agreements that they can get would be wonderful right now. Turkey is all about Turkey. Erdogan is all about Erdogan, and they'll work with Ukraine where they can, and they'll work with Russia where they can. And as long as you understand that, Turkey makes sense. Okay, Thursday, 6th July, Russian TV blast Prigozhin. And I showed a video where they were talking about, like, I knew he was traitor back in the spring. And they're coming at Prigozhin in all kinds of different ways. And it's really wild to watch when Prigozhin was just a hero just a little while ago. I get it, the mutiny, the freedom march, whatever you want to call it. But it's really interesting. Like, they're all on the same page about this kind of thing now. Lukashenko says that he will use Prigozhin's expertise in Belarus. Now, this is one of the few things that actually made sense about Prigozhin and the deal and whatever. Lukashenko stands to benefit from having someone train his military if he, it's a safe harbor for Prigozhin and he gets to train his military if that's what's going to happen. Otherwise, it looks like Lukashenko might be in danger from Prigozhin because he does have his own army. So it's interesting how that'll play out. Lukashenko is also saying that Prigozhin has returned to Russia. He was in St. Petersburg, but I don't know that there was any video or photographic evidence of that. Along the same lines, Prigozhin's just a very dangerous wild card that we just don't know how to deal with or process yet. Okay, switching gears. South American leaders to block Zelensky from EU South American summit. So what happened here was that there was a Latin American and Caribbean states summit connected to the EU. They were working together, and the EU wanted to have this joint declaration that was supportive of Ukraine, and some of the Latin American countries blocked it. Okay, some are chummy, like Venezuela and Nicaragua are chummy with Russia. I don't know who was doing what, why, but I only saw that in RT. I didn't see that in the regular Western press. Politico had an article about how Zelensky mauls the Bulgarian, this is the title, Zelensky mauls Bulgarian president over his opposition to arming Ukraine. So, he was in Sofia. Sofia is a beautiful city. I've been there. He's in Sofia to, as they're voting on NATO. So the meeting with Radev, R-A-D-E-V, he's the president, didn't go so well. He's a former Air Force chief who is more sympathetic to Russia and equivocal on NATO than the prime minister. The prime minister was actually kind of pro-Ukraine. So that meeting went worse than expected, and that's what was in that Politico article. Former U.S. officials had talks with prominent Russians in secret. Okay, so this is called Tier 2 diplomacy. It happens all the time. It's also called back-channel diplomacy, and it's not necessarily something that you should be worried about, although it could be. So here's a scenario where it could be. Like, if they're doing this back-channel diplomacy, trying to work around the Ukrainians, that's bad. If they're doing that by just trying to feel out, like, Russia, what are your demands? What do you need? Hey, here's what our demands are. I don't know how we're going to get there, but we need to keep talking. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, on Friday, Biden came out and claimed that he did not authorize these secret talks, although he knew about them. So my guess is that there's not much to see there. Okay, Russian missile attacks on Lviv kill at least 10. So the Russians constantly say things like, oh, we don't target civilians, and yet they hit a residential block in Lviv in the western side of the country, no military purpose at all, and they do that all the time. Belarus is dismantling 3 Russian training grounds. Okay, I don't know why. There's nothing that strikes me as that's a good or bad thing. It just, the Russians are no longer there. Erdogan tells Zelensky that Ukraine deserves NATO membership, but should enter peace talks with Moscow. This is what I mean by Erdogan works with this side, and then he works with that side to get the best deal for Erdogan. So, okay, take what you can get from that. Zelensky has a difficult road to get all of NATO, the support of all NATO members, and that's true. So here's the way this works. We have a majority vote for a reason, because when you have a majority plus one, you have a minority. You have have the minority not being able to tell the majority what to do. When you have a situation like you have in NATO where you have to have unanimity, so let's say 30 member states, when you have 30 that have to vote, and if one can hold up 29, it's a small minority holding up all these others. And I get it, it's a big deal, but that's where we are. Okay, Syria cracked down on Wagner after Wagner's mutiny in Russia. So, yeah, the Syrian authoritarian strongman president, uh, uh, al-Assad, whatever his name is. I can see him. He's a former eye doctor, and he's a bad guy, but he's cracking down on Wagner after the mutiny in Russia. He doesn't want bad things to happen in his own country. The U.S. sending cluster munitions. This is the big headline, and I'm going to do an entire video on this very shortly. U.S. to send cluster munitions to Ukraine. It's banned by 100 plus nations. I think it's 123 nations, and the UN condemns it. And so RT had an article in among the half dozen or so that I read where the RT just had a headline that UN condemns cluster munitions just because the U.S. was approving it to be sent to Ukraine. It's utter hypocrisy, and you'll see what I'm talking about in the next video. On Saturday, the 8th of July, Erdogan hosts Zelensky and says that the Ukraine deserves membership in NATO. That's good. Of course, he's saying to negotiate, but he's saying that they deserve membership, and so it's good as far as that goes. Another headline, the UK will not supply cluster munitions, says Sunak, and that's okay. They don't have to. They're subscribed to this UN treaty, 120 some odd other nations. The US, Russia, and Ukraine are all not part of that treaty, so none of them really have to worry about it. There was this great video that I'm going to show you about how this guy put together 6 AK-74s, strapped them together, and put them on a swivel so that they can shoot down drones. We'll see how effective that is in times to come, but I'll show you the clip in just a moment. Before I do that, let me get to the last concept here, and that's that Putin's weak. Putin's a lot weaker than we think. I'm going to do a whole video about this, and I want to know your thoughts. Tell me, Putin is strong because, and then fill in the blank, and I want to hear your best arguments. Putin is weak because, and I want to hear your best arguments. But here's some that I'm seeing, and RT is saying, Putin's so much stronger than he was before, and the Western press is saying, no, there's chinks in the armor, and you're seeing Putin being exposed. Well, here's some that's saying this, Putin is cannibalizing Russia's economy to provide for the war. And so this was an interesting article, and it was highlighting Yale professors that were talking about this. And I'm quoting, far from the prevailing narrative of how Putin funds his invasion, Putin's financial lifeline has his merciless cannibalization of Russian economic productivity. Sonneveld and Tian said, these are the two professors from Yale, he has been burning the living room furniture to fuel his battles in Ukraine, but that is now starting to backfire amidst deafening silence and dearth of public support. Now he goes on a little bit more. That includes measures like printing record volumes of Russian ruble out of thin air. So you see the ruble to dollar has significantly shifted over time, forcing institutions to buy near worthless Russian debt assets, hefty windfall taxes on basically anything that moves, and taking billions out of Russia's sovereign wealth fund to square the nation's finances. Okay, so I think that's really a good picture of what's going on. It has been really bad for the Russian economy, although they say nothing to see here. Okay, another one. RT the same day came out and said U.S. imports from Russia double over the last year. Okay, so we've imported 504 million versus 215 million last year, about same time. But is that because of the decline of the ruble, or is it something else? I'm not enough of an economist to know, and if you're an economist, I would love to talk to you and get a sense of what's going on there. Okay. Last thing, anti-Putin Russian forces are planning fresh attacks in Russia, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with this international Russian legion over time. Okay, so I promised you I'd show you the AK-74s and how this, if necessity is the mother of invention, these guys are so incredibly ingenious in what they're trying to do. So they're trying to shoot down drones, and you can use rockets to shoot down drones, but rockets are very expensive. if they can actually pull this off, and they're not actually firing or shooting down, so YouTube censors, don't worry, but they're just showing what they've done. They've taken 6 AK-74s with banana clips in them, and they are putting them on a swivel so that they can lock and load and then be able to shoot all this stuff at wherever the drone is, hopefully knock it out of the sky. But that's very, very creative. So they can get that and they can fire all of them simultaneously, and I think they might have something there. We don't know, time will tell, but these guys are pretty creative. Okay, that's all that I have here for this week. My next video will be about cluster munitions, so you want to understand what's going on there and the way that it's framed by multiple sides and that kind of thing. Thank you for the likes and the shares and the subscribes and the coffees, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. I'll be back tomorrow, and I hope you will be too.